see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Stanley Coren. Thank you, Stanley, for joining me for this dialogue.
Pleased to be here.
And I just wanted to give a little background about you. You're a scientist and professor emeritus in the Department of Psychology at the University of British Columbia. And you're also the author of many best-selling books on dogs. A couple of titles I see here are How Dogs Think, Understanding the Canine Mind, How to Speak Dog, and The Modern Dog. And I saw your webpage. There's a whole list of books you've written about dogs, and they're available on your website, which is at stanleycoren.com. And you also write a blog called Canine Corner on the Psychology Today website. So is there more you'd like to say about your background by way of introduction?
Well, I've been doing psychological research for a number of years with both people and dogs. And I've written about a dozen or so books about dogs, and they're available, as they say, in better bookstores everywhere. And they've been recently well received. For example, my most recent book, Born to Bark, won the Maxwell Medal from the Dog Writers Association of America, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'm just showing your website right now, and you have like all kinds of articles and information about dogs there as well. So you seem to be very prolific in your work around this topic.
Well, I've been doing a lot of writing and a lot of work for a lot of years. What else can I tell you?
Yeah, it adds up, huh, after the years.
Oh yeah, and I had a national TV show here in Canada for about 5 years on dogs, and I do a regular CBC, it's Canadian Broadcasting Corps, do a regular radio column for them.
Okay. Well, what we wanted to talk about was the relationship of dogs and empathy, and you'd recently written an article on the Psychology Today blog, which I'll show here. It's Canine Empathy, Your Dog Really Does Care If You Are Unhappy. And it's new research shows that that dogs respond to their owner's unhappiness. So I thought perhaps we could talk about that article, kind of go through, your insights about dog empathy, and perhaps kind of expand, the discussion around that.
Sure. There's a lot of controversy among psychologists as to whether or not dogs really do show empathy. There's not much of an argument as far as the average dog owner is concerned. Most dog owners understand that when they are unhappy, their dog tends to respond to them. And in fact, the truth of the matter is that every dog has what we call an instinctive intelligence. And that instinctive intelligence really means it's what the dog was bred to do. So retrievers retrieve, and herding dogs herd, and that sort of thing. Well, companion dogs, those are the little frou-frou dogs which you tend to have, on your lap and on your sofa and that sort of thing, were actually bred for the most part to be empathetic. And so we've been working on that, and you can think of the process as being sort of seat of the pants genetic. You have one dog who's very attentive to people and very responsive to your emotional states. Well, that dog's going to be taken care of a lot better than any other dog. And then you have a friend who has a dog of the opposite sex who has similar qualities. So you breed them together and you end up with a line of dogs who are particularly empathetic. And there are some breeds of dogs which are sort of notable for that reason. In fact, this has been known for a long time. To give you an example, the word spaniel. Now, we've all heard that. It's a label which is used for a lot of different kinds of dogs. Now, generally speaking, dog breeds are named after either the person who created them or most usually the place. So, you've got an Airedale Terrier from County Air, you have a German Shepherd from Germany, and so on and so forth. So the span in Spaniel should stand for Spain, except that none of these breeds of dogs were ever bred in Spain. So why are we calling them Spaniels? Well, the reason is that at the time when those breeds were being created, the best lovers in the world were supposed to be the Spaniel. And all of these dogs are so kissy-faced and so attentive that that had to be acknowledged in some way. So it was acknowledged in their breed names. So they became Spaniels because they are lovers, they are attentive, they are caring. So there we've got a whole line of dogs who are basically being named on the basis of their empathy and their responsiveness to human beings. Now, psychologists, a lot of psychologists tend to be a bit sort of hard to find a word for it, but let's just say human elitists, okay? Sort of all the complex kinds of emotions are things which we attribute to human beings, and it's less likely that we're going to attribute them to lower animals, even to our dogs. And so when we refer to the fact that a dog is acting in an empathic way, there are, all you have to do is to stand in the corridor of a psychology department and say, dogs have real empathy, and people will flood out of their offices and all, arguing one side or the other of that particular debate. So, there's a tendency for them to sort of look for explanations which explain the behavior which you think is being empathic as something else. And that's in part what my article was about, my blog article. Psychologists tend to think that rather than showing true empathy, or at least some psychologists, not me, because obviously I'm a psychologist, but anyway, there are some psychologists who tend to believe that rather than showing true empathy, dogs show what we would call emotional contagion. Now, emotional contagion simply means that you respond to the emotions of the individuals around you. Sort of a very simple example of this is if you walk into a nursery in a hospital. If one baby starts to cry, they all start to cry. I mean, they're not being empathic. They've just simply caught on to the emotion over there. And of course, we all see this. I mean, the most recent Godzilla film, somebody acts in a panic and then everybody acts in this panic. That's emotional contagion. That's not really empathy involved in their part. So they tend to, or the people who are trying to explain away empathy in dogs tend to say, well, if you're acting sad, the dog will act supportive, not because he's being supportive, but because his sadness has basically is a reflection of your sadness. I mean, they've caught sadness from you as a sort of contagion. So they come over to comfort you, not because they're being empathic, but rather because they want your comfort for them. So there was a very neat little experiment which was conducted by a couple of gals in the UK. And
one of them I might mention is Deborah Custance, and I did interview her as well. So
okay, yes, she is one of the two authors on this, and what they did was a very straightforward kind of a study. Okay, they put two people in a room, one of whom was a stranger to the dog, and the other one of whom was the dog's owner. And then basically they had the owner or the stranger fake an emotion. In this particular case, they would cry. And they then watched the response of the dogs. Now, the important thing here is that if there's emotional contagion and the owner cries, then one would expect the dog to feel, upset and go seek comfort from the owner. But if the stranger cries, you would expect the same thing, because the dog then catches, if you will, the unhappy emotion and goes to the individual who provides him with comfort. So you'd expect the dog then to go to the owner to find some sort of solace. But if the dog's really being empathic, then in fact the dog should go over to the person crying, even if that person is not his owner. Now, somebody might say, well, they're just attracted by the strange sounds or something like that. So the researchers also had individuals hum in a sort of a very odd kind of a staccato way, and that got the dogs basically looking at them, but they didn't come over in any direction. So the dogs would come over to the person who cried, regardless of whether it was a stranger or their owner, and were not otherwise affected by strange noises. And that seems like a really simple, straightforward demonstration of empathy. You more or less respond to the emotions of the individuals. Now, we use that. Psychologists use that particular ability of dogs as part of what we call pet-assisted therapy. Pet-assisted therapy is based on the fact that dogs are, in fact, responding in an empathic way. And when they see somebody who's disturbed or who is showing a lot of tension, dogs will usually gravitate in their direction. And somehow or another, the touch of a dog, and if we pet them, we get an immediate physiological response. So if you're petting a familiar and friendly dog, we find that your heart rate slows, your breathing becomes more regular, your muscle tension gets to release, and in fact, you even get a lower concentration of stress-related hormones in your blood. That's very, very useful if you're doing therapy. And it's also the basis of what we call the hospital visitation dogs. There are a lot of hospital visitation programs which bring dogs into hospitals or other rehab types of settings. And the sole purpose of these dogs is to provide comfort. And people do respond. They do respond by relaxing and that sort of thing. And the dogs seem to recognize which are the individuals who actually need the comfort. So they don't go over to the nurse, who might have a treat in her pocket, but rather go over to the person in the bed who seems to be needy in this particular case.
Okay, you're probably familiar with Franz de Waal and his model of empathy. He calls it the Russian doll model. And it's saying that different parts, the most primitive parts of the brain have some capacity, empathic type of capacity, for example, that emotional contagion. And then there's various layers of the brain. As we develop the prefrontal cortex, that's like adds another layer kind of on top of it. So there's this notion of empathy as a multi-layered kind of a process. And what you were talking about is that emotional contagion is that, deer or other animals, that if one is startled within the herd, that ripple effect goes throughout the whole herd of that startle effect. Or as you were saying with children, when in the nursery, when one cries, it kind of is a emotional ripple effect that kind of passes through the whole nursery. And that so that dogs have that capacity too. And so there's one kind of level that's seen in terms of empathy going from that basic level to a sense of self-awareness, where children, I think it's at a couple of years old, they start recognizing themselves in the mirror and have that sense that, oh, that's me in the mirror, whereas dogs don't have that capacity for that self-awareness, as I understand it. So we're kind of like talking that they have some capacities, aspects of empathy, but maybe not the full perspective taking, kind of this cognitive empathy. So I guess we're kind of looking at, what parts of empathy they have and maybe what parts they don't have, and how that's kind of how I'm kind of seeing it. I'm just wondering how that fits.
Well, the mind of a dog is equivalent to a human 2 to 2.5-year-old. So that means to say that dog will have sort of all the basic emotions that a 2.5-year-old will. And someplace in that range, in that age range, we begin to see dogs, we begin to see children wander over to a child who is distressed. And although they're not very good at it, they seem to be trying to offer some kind of comfort. So it's not surprising that we get that in dogs, but also you have to remember that systematic breeding, which we've been engaging in with dogs, which makes them quite different in that way. I mean, we are not breeding people to be empathic. So we are breeding dogs to respond to human cues. Let me give you a simple example. Suppose I point to something, okay? A dog understands that that's a communication gesture, and he looks in the direction I am pointing, even if he's a young puppy. Suppose I have a wolf, and suppose that wolf has been reared from 3 or 4 days of age in a human family, and I now point to something. That wolf looks at my hand. He doesn't look in the direction I'm going, doesn't recognize that that's a communication gesture. The difference is that we have systematically bred the dog to pick up on communication gestures. Well, emotion is basically communication. I mean, the reason that we are wired to have emotional expressions is so that we telegraph that information to other beings who we're living with. So that they know when we're approachable, they know when we're not approachable, depending upon whether we smile or whether we snarl. But they also know when we need succor in some way or another. We need some kind of assistance because they read those types of responses. And it's important for us because, you know, if somebody's hurting, then they're not going to be contributing to our social organization or unit or family or whatever else. So providing them with that sort of assistance is good for the social organization as a whole, but it's also good for us because the way that evolution has set this up, it's things which are good or useful for the species tend to be pleasurable. So sex is pleasurable because it procreates the species. Well, in fact, keeping the emotional health of other individuals going is useful for the species. So we feel good if we make somebody else feel good. Well, now, if we have bred dogs to pick up the communication gestures, and if emotions are communication gestures, then in fact it's not surprising that dogs pick up on our emotional communications. They pick up on our expressions. Now, the neat thing is that a lot of dogs, and in fact, I'd say the vast majority of dogs, and especially those companion breeds, not only pick up on those, so they know that if we're happy, we're approachable, and if we're snarling, it's best to hide in the corner, but in fact, they have picked up on that other set of emotions. So they have picked up on the fact that we are hurting, that we are sad, we are despondent, or that sort of thing. And then they are doing exactly what another human being would do. And we've bred them that way. So they go over and they, in fact, rest against us. If we let them, they jump up on the sofa. We start to pet them. And what happens? Well, that despondent expression, which that idea that we're depressed and we're radiating that sadness starts to go away. That's the reward for the dog. In the same way that we are rewarded for being empathic by going over to somebody who's been crying or whatever else, and they stop crying and maybe they smile. So dogs are responding in this situation in exactly the same way that human beings are. No, they're not going to be as good as a well-trained therapist, and no, they're not going to be as good even as the average adult, but they're going to be as good as the average 2 or 3-year-old, maybe a little bit better because of that special breeding that we've given them.
So they would be coming over and doing consoling behavior, and that would maybe release oxytocin, the in our bodies, and kind of calm us down, and that would maybe be the reward, that warmth that comes from connecting.
Yeah, the dogs have oxytocin in the same way that human beings have oxytocin, and it flows in exactly the same times. when a mother nurses her child, we get this huge surge of oxytocin. Well, guess what? When mama dog is nursing her puppies, you get that same sort of release of oxytocin. So a lot of that stuff is very similar, in dogs and people. It's just that dogs are much more social. I mean, we've really bred that social responsiveness into dogs. It's in part what makes them such wonderful companions for us. I mean, the reason that dogs are such perfect companions is because we've bred them to be perfect companions. Um, and in fact, there are some dogs who are so responsive that, in fact, we single them out in therapeutic situations. So, for example, if you went to the UK, if a doctor says that, in fact, this is usually done for elderly individuals who are living alone, that it'll be therapeutic for you to have a dog as a companion, because we know it sort of provides all sorts of psychological benefits. In fact, you can petition their medical system, and they'll pay part of the cost of the dog, not the whole thing, not its maintenance, but part of the cost. And in fact, there's some breeds of dogs, like the little Papillon or the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, which are prescribed so often by physicians that when I was over there, I heard them referred to as prescription dogs. So, I mean, this is recognizing that they have these abilities, and I mean, I'm now of an age where it's nice to have a sucky-faced dog. It's very comforting when, you get the aches and pains and that sort of things associated with aging. And we can show, for example, that these overall effects which are associated with having the dog, or if you will, having the dog responding to us, okay, so relieving our stress, is actually beneficial. The research shows that, for example, if you have a dog, you are less likely to use medical services. You're only 1/4 as likely to become clinically depressed. And there's a wonderful gal at the University of Pennsylvania who ran a series of studies in which in some of them she looked at men who had just had their first heart attacks, and then she followed them up. Well, in fact, 4 years later, she found that the men who had dogs, in fact, were 7 times more likely to be alive. Now that's darn good, stress relief. Now, obviously, if the dogs were not being empathic, if they're being, I'm on my own, I've got a cat to chase and not paying any attention to you, they're not going to provide that stress relief. So we can sort of look at that kind of data and flip it on its head. Instead of saying, well, what does it say about our relationship to dogs? But rather, we flip it on its head and say, oh yeah, well, they must be responding to our moods and providing support. So, in fact, that is sort of proof of empathy. Pardon.
Yeah, so one thing I'm kind of looking at is that the dogs want to supply support, and as I understand it with empathy, that we use mirror neurons to actually read each other's emotion. So when we do an action, and when we see an action, the same neurons fire in our brain. So if you're laughing or if you're coughing, and if I'm coughing, there's certain neurons firing, and when I see coughing, those neurons fire maybe a little bit less intensity. So do you think I don't know if there's been any studies about dogs. Are they using some form of mirror neurons for
No.
reading or?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, that research has not been done in dogs. I mean, we've done that research predominantly in monkeys and primates. It would not surprise me if there was some similar kind of a thing going on in dogs. We know that dogs are extremely attentive. They do have this self-concept. I mean, you mentioned before, the idea that dogs don't respond to images in the mirror, whereas, kids do at about age, in the 2 to 2.5 range, about the level that dogs are. So one might say, well, why aren't the dogs responding to their image in the mirror if they have this sort of self-concept? Well, we might say to ourselves, okay, why are human beings responding? Well, the reason human beings are responding is we're very visual animals. And vision is our primary sense of identifying the world. And that's not the case for dogs. For dogs, their basic and most important sense is their sense of smell. Hearing is used next, and vision is used to confirm or to catch something or that sort of thing. So one of the things which you can say about mirrors is they don't smell like a dog. Now, a wonderful character by the name of Mark Bekoff, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Colorado, he ran a heroic study, and the reason it's heroic is it involves some pretty messy stuff. He followed his dog Jake around when Jake was walking in the snow. And what he would do is he would gather up patches of yellow snow and run ahead and put those piles of yellow snow in the pathway where Jake would eventually get there. Now, some of those piles of yellow snow were made by Jake, and some of them were made by other dogs who were out walking. And then he just monitored what happened when the dog reached those piles of yellow snow. And in fact, Jake would spend quite a bit of time on the snow which had been yellowed by strangers, but very little time on the snow which had been yellowed by himself. In other words, he recognized himself. Now that's really the doggy equivalent of seeing yourself in the mirror.
Wow, that's a whole different way of looking at it. Really, do you recognize yourself in the, and maybe you recognize yourself in some senses and not in other senses, or
No, I mean, I don't think that for the most part human beings recognize the scent of other human
yeah,
beings.
that's true. Right, uh-huh.
But I mean, I'm sure that we're radiating pheromones all the time, the same way the dogs are.
Yeah, so that's just the kind of it's the more the complication of self-recognition, what that really means then.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to understand the simplest way of looking at dogs. I mean, there are two extremes which people tend to use. One is that dogs are really four-footed people in fur coats. And there are a lot of people who think that. I mean, and there's the other extreme, which is that dogs are basically biological machines. So, my little beagle, for example, is not anything like a person. He's more like a collection of the biological equivalents of gears and levers and pulleys and that sort of thing in a beagle-shaped chassis. And he's programmable rather than having, conscious learning or that sort of thing. Well, the truth of the matter is that neither of those two extremes is correct. If you just remember that the dog is roughly the same as a human 2.5-year-old, then you can begin to set boundaries on this sort of thing. So, a 2.5-year-old, as I mentioned before, has all the basic emotions. So he'll have, anger and fear and that sort of thing, and surprise and happiness. But he's not going to have the complex social emotions like shame and guilt and pride. But in between that one really complex set of social emotions and the basic emotions are those sort of gray area emotions. And empathy is, in fact, one of those gray area emotions. So we would expect that, in fact, some dogs will have empathy and some won't. So if you told me that you had a Doberman Pinscher, or a Pit Bull Terrier who didn't show any empathy, I would say, okay, well, that's probably more expectable. But if you had something like an English Cocker Spaniel, you told me that he didn't have any empathy, I would be very, very surprised because those dogs are highly responsive.
Mm-hmm. So just as there's a spectrum of empathy with humans, from, psychopaths to very empathic, that spectrum probably exists within dogs as well. So there's all these different gradations of the level of empathy. Some dogs are even bred for deeper resonance with humans, and so we really have to see empathy as maybe as a gradation and like a dimmer switch that it can be low or high levels.
That's right. And a pretty good predictor of whether you're going to get empathy in a dog is its breed. I'm sure there are doggy psychopaths without conscience, but generally speaking, the companion dogs are not those.
Well, there's another aspect to this in terms of I've heard the differentiation between empathy and sympathy, and I think in your article you had actually used the word sympathy, and as well. So empathy is usually the feeling of someone else. For example, if you're in distress, I feel and empathize with your distress. And then sympathy is like, oh, that causes a secondary level of stress. I feel stressed about your stress. So that's kind of like one definition of sympathy as a kind of as a secondary uh, emotion where it's about me. Then you become very sympathetic and it becomes more about you. And sometimes it's even seen as a block to empathy, just feeling and resonating with the other. So, how do you see that differentiation between sympathy and empathy,
Well,
basically?
empathy is the process. So empathy is the process by which you recognize that another individual is in distress, for example, um, and it tends to produce an emotional response in you. So that's the process. Sympathy is what you do. So it's the emotions which you then tend to express and the things which you tend to do. So, because you are feeling sympathy for someone who, lost a partner or something like that, so, you'll drop by and bring them some food for dinner or something like that. So, sympathy is more the sort of whole pattern of behaviors, part of which are emotional responses, whereas empathy is the trigger in this particular case.
Okay, so the sympathy is kind of the action, the appropriate action that's kind of coming out of that
That's right.
experience. Uh-huh.
That's and it does have an emotional component in you, you know, but it really is the behaviors which you're doing.
Uh-huh. Yeah, there's a lot of different definitions. I've interviewed, a lot of academics around this. Dan Batson, who has he's kind of looked at 8 different ways the word empathy is used. So there is a lot of different use of the word empathy, and um, I've kind of created a definition, kind of I've put together. Perhaps I could just run by you to kind of get your take on it. I'm seeing empathy as kind of 4 parts. The first part is self-empathy, so that's sensory awareness, self-awareness of what's even going on inside of ourselves. The second part is mirrored empathy, which is kind of through mirror neurons. And the better we are, having awareness of our own feelings, the better we are at actually feeling through mirrored neurons, what's going on in others. Then there's kind of the third part, which is a imaginative empathy, or sometimes called cognitive empathy, or perspective taking, which is like kind of that role taking that when you have that sense of self-awareness, it kind of adds that component. And then the fourth part is I'm calling empathic action, which is that as we kind of as I see your humanity or your dogmanity or whatever, I see the essence of your beingness and my beingness, and I see where you are and where I am, that I want to take action to kind of contribute to your well-being as well as my well-being. It's the action that flows out of that I call empathic action, which sounds like you're calling kind of sympathetic action.
Well, I mean, I think if I were constructing such a scheme, I would probably stick with the last three. The first one I don't think is necessary. That's just a self-perception, and it's, it doesn't require it. You don't feel empathic toward yourself. I think I hurt, therefore I hurt. It's a bit of a circle in that. Um, I like to think that empathy is part of the social glue, which binds together units in humans, um, and it's very important. It is important within a family. It's important within a pair, within a couple. Um, because in the absence of empathy, the unit does not hold together. And it's really important to recognize that even in individuals who we are training to be non-empathic in many ways. So take special forces groups who have to go out and have to shoot people. I mean, you can't have empathy for the person which you're going to shoot for. Well, you might say to yourself, well, we're training the empathy out of them. The answer is yes, but for the unit to work, they have to have empathy for their own comrades. So, in fact, you will hear sort of the SEAL team leader say, that is your brother. You have to feel what he is feeling. So, in fact, although we're taking empathy away in the one case because of the task that we're doing, we are putting the empathy in and emphasizing it for the social unit. So that's the way I look at empathy. Empathy is, in fact, that sort of social glue. You need it because if you don't, then people are going to fly off in different directions with their own particular emotional internal states, and then the social unit ceases to exist. So empathy is necessary because we want to stay together. If my wife is hurting, for me not to respond says something, okay? It says, I don't care. And by responding in some empathic way, even if she doesn't want immediate support at that particular moment, has already provided the glue which is necessary to keep us together. So that's the reason, or that's the way that I would view empathy.
Okay, well, that's I always in these dialogues I often start with like, what's your metaphor of empathy? And because that kind of creates a picture of it, and so your metaphor is that empathy is like the glue that holds us together. And I love that metaphor. And so for me in these dialogues, really the purpose of these dialogues is to explore how do we build a culture of empathy. So I'm kind of like looking at like how do we create a global culture that is using super glue, right, to hold it together, because we have so many different parts of society going off in so many different directions, causing so much conflict and so much pain. And so from your, research in psychology and from studying dogs, what kind of insights do you have about how do we create, more glue, empathic glue within society?
Well, I can't deal with this sort of overall social issue. I mean, you know, how do we build empathy between the U.S. and North Korea? I mean, that's completely beyond me. But I can say that there have been studies which have basically shown that if you build into a young child as they're growing up, if you build in a set of experiences, then in fact you begin to allow that child to show empathy. And the best way, and again, of course, it's going to show my biases, has to do with interactions with a dog. And there's lots and lots of research on this sort of thing. Basically, a young child will tend to look at a dog as their companion. In some respects, by the time the child is almost at sort of grade school age, that child's already starting to look at that dog as his companion, but he's more responsible for the dog than the dog is responsible for him. And the dog is, in fact, a totally uncritical companion. So the dog never says to the child, you're stupid, you shouldn't have done that, or don't you feel guilty, or something like that. But the dog expresses emotions and does provide social support. So young children, we find, begin to develop empathy much faster when they, in fact, are reared in a house where there's a companion dog, where there's a dog who they get to interact with, especially if they have certain caretaking duties associated with the dog. They don't have to be a lot. Put Lassie's bowl down for her food or something like that. Or fill her water, or to walk her around the block, or whatever else. I mean, it really can be at that kind of a level. What the child also learns under these circumstances is how to read the emotions, because the emotional expression in dogs, although they're not exactly the same as the expressions in human beings, they are quite readable. So the child is then learning that there's this utility in reading emotional expressions. And in fact, we find that when kids then go to school, so the kid who has grown up in his preschool years with the companionship of a dog, they are more likely to be, first of all, liked by other children, to be liked by the teacher, and more likely to be put in leadership roles. So there is some responsiveness which is going on here. And I think that the responsiveness is the child is learning how to read emotions, is learning that in fact, if my dog is doing this and looking like that, if I reach out and grab him, the dog's going to yelp and he's going to run away from me. And so you start to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe I should watch his emotions a little bit more closely because I want him close to me. I don't want him yelping and running away from me. And so the child begins to develop this sort of give and take. So if my dog is like this, then I should be like this, and then we can interact like this. Well, if you do it for the dog, then you're going to do it for your brother, you're going to do it for your sister, you're going to do it for all of the kids in your playgroup, and ultimately, hopefully, you do it for all of mankind. Now, I am not saying that the solution to all of our problems and to the development of empathy is to make sure that everybody lives with Lassie. I mean, that's not my aim. But I am simply saying that there is an example as how this early experience, and in this case, it's almost an early experience with a compatriot or somebody who, even at that younger age, you have to nurture a bit. That helps. And in the long run, that may be the solution, is to begin to develop these things earlier on. Now, I don't know how one would wire that into an early education program or something like that, because that's not my area of specialty. But I do know that the research says that, you got that little pup in over there and you have the child interacting with it. That's a good first step.
So the all those things you're talking about is the relationship between young children and their dogs is like teaching. They're learning that empathic, how to be empathic, how to kind of read the dog, how to nurture the dog. And I would add even one part is, I mean, I had a dog, a golden retriever growing up. I remember when he died, it was like, oh my, I mean, it still would almost bring tears, even now at this, all these years later, I cried for it was like hours, I was just so distraught by it. But it was that physical touch too, right? It's as you mentioned before, it's like, golden retrievers are big, shaggy, very warm, kind of cuddly, and, playing with the dog. And it was that oxytocin, that sense of warmth and relaxation and that lack of judgment that you're talking about. We get judged by others, and to have someone there, a presence that's non-judgmental, I mean, it is very nurturing.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. I mean, that's also one of the really nice things about dogs, which is one of the reasons why they provide more supportiveness, for example, than cats, is that, if you indicate to the dog that you want their presence, you want to touch them and something like that, I mean, they read that and they come over. And then, we do know, I mean, there are the studies which I mentioned before about the physiological responses to touch. But, we know from work which Harry Harlow did way back, looking at the relationship between mothers and offspring and the importance of touch and sort of maintaining a bond and maintaining a relationship. And I mean, we train clinical psychologists, for example, to watch the touch interactions between people, especially if they're doing couples therapy. So, for example, in a couples therapeutic situation, we train them not to have their receptionist come just indicate to them it's time for them to go into the office, but for the therapist to come out um, and to get a chance to observe the couple out in the waiting room. And if they are touching, in fact, just the sort of casual touch, reach over and sort of touch their hand, or as they get up, touch the other shoulder to get them to move or whatever else, then in fact you have a much stronger likelihood that there is still a bond there and that you're going to be able to do something about it. So touch is very, very important. And one of the neat things about dogs is that our bond to them grows as we touch, and their bond with us grows as they touch us or are touched by us. And that sort of thing is sort of the payoff from empathy, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
The payoff is that you see somebody being despondent, and you go over, you touch them, they touch you, and you've been paid for responding in an empathic way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that sense of warmth that kind of comes to that connection is kind of the payoff. The cortisol or the stress hormones are diminished, and you get that warm kind of glow feeling that kind of is the maybe the payoff of empathy. Or one of them. So what I'm kind of seeing is to build a culture of empathy, it's going to be many little steps, many different areas. There's the area where we can foster this empathic connection with dogs, with children. So maybe even in the classroom, I've heard of programs that bring dogs into the classroom, and they're kind of like companion. I don't know what the word is for it, but they're just their presence creates a calming effect within the classroom, and that there can be like programs to teach, even kind of explain what's going on here. How can you care for the dog and things like that. So there's a wide variety of individual steps that we can do to nurture and foster creating this super glue within society.
Yeah, and there are some instances, for example, where the therapeutic aspect of the dog is quite remarkable. For example, we now know that when you get very tense and you're under emotional stress, we don't think as clearly. It's harder for us to learn. We tend to respond in sort of habitual kinds of ways. We're not open to new experiences, that sort of thing. Well, when we look at early reading programs, we find that that's one of the reasons why kids tend not to learn how to read very well, because the way that they demonstrate that they have mastered the reading is they have to read to somebody, okay? And when they do so, they're always being corrected. The tension level ratchets up, and then their ability to sort of handle the material begins to get very bad. And a number of programs have now started which have reading assistance dogs. I mean, it sounds absolutely silly, but it actually works. What they do is they get a dog, and the child sits and reads to the dog. And you can get a nice dog like your golden retriever or a Labrador retriever, and they will stay alert to sort of the sound of a human voice. And the child is being paid by the simple attention that they're getting from the dog, and there's no judgment going in this sort of thing. If they want to, they can reach out and touch the dog. So their overall tension level is going down, and in fact, they're being rewarded for the simple act of reading, even if they're doing it badly. Okay, and we find that in fact, under such circumstances, kids will, who have seemed to have been blocked in their progress in reading at some point or another, suddenly break through and begin to sort of make the kind of progress. And it's the presence of the dog in this simple case. And it's the way we respond to that kind of presence.
And the same is true in hospitals. I've heard about bringing dogs into the hospitals. I imagine that's the same kind of process then.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've seen things which, if I had a more spiritual nature, people would probably call miracles, or a woman following a major automobile accident in which she lost her son and daughter-in-law, had not spoken for a month, and a therapy dog was a golden retriever like yours, was brought in for her, and the dog went up to her bed and started nuzzling her hand, and then sort of put its front paws on the front, and all of a sudden, she reached out and she touched the dog's head and she said, "You're just like my Goldie." And it was the first words that she'd spoken in a month. And so the breakthrough was right then and there. I would think the nurse was about ready to fall over. And it was all because of the presence of the dog. And, we brought that dog back every day for the next week because, she was actually starting to talk again because of this. So this is the kind of thing which you now that's not a case of empathy. It's the empathy which perhaps had the dog go up to her in the first place because they recognize the need, but it's our response to that behavior, which we read as being empathic, and eventually empathic behavior. Eventually, we don't read behaviors as being empathic or sympathetic, but supportive. Because, we have this need, if you will, to have somebody take care of us and respond to us, but also we have this need for independence. And so you want to sort of, yes, use that in the early stages, but next stage out is you want to be independent. It's don't worry about me now, okay? Mm-hmm. It's sort of shut the empathy valve at this point in time because I want to do this myself.
Yeah, well, it's maybe empathizing with someone's need for autonomy, and
that could be a way to look at it.
Yeah, and giving people space for that, and that takes almost like a reading too. You can see if you can read if that's what they're needing at that point in time. So that almost takes empathy just to have that awareness too. Yeah. So, well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Is there any other? I could go on for hours because you just have such a wealth of information and experience. Is there any kind of final point that you feel we should cover before we come to a close?
No, I mean, I'm a university professor. You wind us up and ask us, and we talk until you stop asking questions. I think that it's really important to recognize that, and now for me, of course, my concern is the human-animal bond, but it really is important to recognize that the dog is capable of having feelings toward us, okay? They are not little human beings, but they do have the ability to have feelings for us, and it's okay to have the feelings back. I mean, that's a really important thing. And if it embarrasses you, then do it when you're alone in the room with the dog. Because when you're alone in the room with the dog, all of us do silly things. We sing to them and flash up their head and say, "Oh, what you do," and all that sort of things. Those sort of things we would do with a young child if we had the child in the room by herself. But we don't want other adults sort of looking at us and sort of being critical. So, take Lassie in the other room and let her lick your face.
Well, on that note, I'll say goodbye, and thank you so much, Stanley, for sharing your insights and stories and metaphors and with us.
Okay, I hope it was helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.